Thank you. I'm going to put another 5 minutes in the service so I can rearrange furniture, okay? Not a problem. Thank you. Great job. Thank you so much, guys. Thank you. Heal the world, yes. And we will make it a better place. Now, the 9 o'clock folks will catch on to these jokes. That rhymed, didn't it? And I hope the 11 o'clock do also. I thought they were good jokes, but you judge. A Chicago bank once asked for a letter of recommendation for a young man who had applied for a job. And so they wrote the investment house in Boston, where he was from, and said, please send us a letter of recommendation. And the letter they got said, this is a fantastic individual because of his because of who he was. Oh, shoot. Here's what they wrote. They say, you know, this is a fantastic young man because he was born from a Cabot. His mother was a Lowell. Further back, there's a happy blend of Kennedys and Rockefellers and Vanderbilts in his background. And we recommend him highly for this work. A few weeks later, the Chicago bank sent a note saying that the information supplied by the investment house was inadequate. It read, we are not contemplating using the young man for breeding purposes, just for work. Rob caught on. Okay, now, number 2. You know, we always want to keep up with the Joneses or the Smiths or whatever they happen to be, right? I mean, we want to. And sometimes we're motivated by it. And there was a young man who lived in Houston who met a guy from Dallas. And the guy in Dallas had a Rolls Royce. And in his Rolls Royce, he had a phone. Now, this is before cell phone time, okay? And this young man was really, really impressed. And so what he did is he went home and he saved for a couple of years and he bought himself a Rolls Royce and he put a phone in it, back when that was not common. So what he did, his name was Bob, he said, what I'm going to do is call Bill this morning. And he called Bill and he said, Bill, I'm calling you from my Rolls Royce. And also, I am calling you on my phone, which is in the Rolls Royce. And Bill said to him, can you hold for a minute? One of my other car phones is ringing. He didn't make it. You understand? He really wanted to be equal with. I'm going to talk about Elijah, okay? To heck with that. All right, there we go. All right. Elijah the prophet. Gosh, Vicki thought they were funny this morning. I don't know about you guys. Anyway, but she was still asleep. I mean, you know, what can I say? Anyway, this morning I do want to talk about Elijah the prophet. And I want to talk about a story that's in 2 Kings, and I want to interpret it metaphysically as we move along. But before we start, Elisha was the second prophet of Israel. He was born somewhere, or he was around somewhere around 850 BCE, they believe, and he was a man who followed Elijah. Elijah was the prophet who was looking for God and found God as a still small voice. You remember him. Elijah followed him as the second prophet. Elijah was compared to and is compared to Jesus. He was the forerunner, if you would, of Jesus. Because here's some of the things that happened in Elijah's life and some of the things he got credit for. He was in Jericho, and the wells in Jericho, the water had gone bad, and the people were complaining about it, and they were thirsty, obviously. And they said to Jericho, They said to Elijah, what can we do about it? So Elijah said, well, give me a bowl, an empty bowl, and put salt in the bowl. So they did so. He took the bowl to the well, put the salt in, and overnight the water was pure again. Now, he obviously knew how to treat water, right? He probably experienced that before. But the people in Jericho thought it was a great miracle. The second thing is that Elijah had a friend, a woman and a man who lived in Israel. And when he would travel through, he would stay at their home. Because he was always invited there, because the woman and the man felt like he was a mission, or he was a prophet of God. They felt like he was just about God itself. And so Elijah's coming through, and he gets a call, or gets a message, and he goes over to the person's house, and he finds out that their son has died. And the story goes that Elijah went into the room alone, told them to leave, and that he breathed life into this child, and then he put his body around the child to warm the child up. I always kind of look like simply that he knew how to perform CPR, right? And that he understood that he had to keep this child warm so the child could survive. But it was considered to be, and it is, a miracle. And then the other thing he did was that there were 100 soldiers who were getting ready to go into battle, and they were just really hungry. And so he took a couple of loaves of bread, and he gave it to the soldiers. And one of them said, well, this isn't enough food to go around. And he said, just eat, and you'll find out there's plenty. And so the 2 loaves of bread fed the 100 soldiers. Any of this ring any bells about Jesus, okay? Feeding the 5,000? About Jesus raising 2 or 3 people from the dead? About Jesus teaching us about more of a consciousness, if you would, than maybe what Elijah had at that time. And we'll talk about it a little bit. Now, Elijah was in a city, the city of Dorth. And in that city, there was a widow. And this widow came to Elijah and said, Elijah, I need help. And of course he said, what's the problem? She said, well, my husband that you know very well, who was a leader of a small study group, and that's how Elijah moved around Israel in small study groups. And he understands, and he was a man that stood in awe of God and understood you and had faith in you. And so therefore I have faith in you. So will you help me? And he said, what do you want me to do? And she said, well, I've got a real dilemma. I have 2 boys, and I have a lot of debt, and I don't have any money to pay the debt. And that day and time, what could happen is if you owed somebody money, they could take your property, and they didn't want her property because she didn't have anything of value, or they could take your children, and they would become indebted servants, and sometimes they would serve for life to pay off the debt. So she was sitting there with this dilemma of how am I going, I've lost my husband, now I'm going to lose my children. So just think about that for a second as you think about it, and know that this woman, if you would, must have been in a great deal of fear and a great deal of pain and was seeking a way out, a way how to release the fear and let the good come into her life. And so in that pain, in that situation, she was able to stop and to know that she needed to go to the Christ within, they didn't call that then, Spirit within, the Holy Spirit, the I am. Now, Elisha, metaphysically, means spiritual I am. In Hebrew, it means God is a Savior, to whom God gives salvation. You see the tie? Metaphysically, Elijah means the spiritual I am. So what this widow was doing, she was going to the spiritual I am. Consciousness that day and time said somebody else had it. But she really had it within herself. But maybe didn't see it quite that way. And so what happens is that this woman, if you would, is referred to in such a way that she represents faith. Metaphysically, she represents faith. You don't ask for help from anybody unless you have some faith. You don't go do what they tell you to do unless you have some faith. So if we use it metaphysically, the spiritual I am within this woman, who was a person of faith, who knew God, trusted God, was speaking to her and giving her the answers to how she might solve the problem that she had. What she didn't do was give up. What she didn't do was take her 2 sons and try to leave the country, because that wouldn't have worked. Instead, she stayed right where she was to solve the challenge. And so she was a woman of faith. And you know, as a woman of faith, she believed in the power of the mind linked to the power to change substance. Now, what that means is she believed that energy could be changed in today's world, in today's language. That energy could change, and that she could actually manifest that change. But in that day and time, she thought, again, she had to go to somebody else to help her do that, to give her the instruction. You and I go directly to source to get the instruction. That's what we learn from this. We honor the spiritual I am. We honor the Christ within. And so it's important for us to become, if you would, receptive to that. The power of faith. Let me give you a more modern day example. A little fellow who lived in the Midwest. And he had wanted a stamp album for his birthday. And his grandmother had promised him one. So his birthday comes and it goes. And a few days later, he's assuming, and he's checking the mail every day, that it'll be there. Just knowing that maybe Grandma was late. And after 4 or 5 days, his mother said to him, "Son, I'm not really sure you're going to get that stamp album." He said, "Oh, yeah. Mom, it's in the mail. It's coming to me." And she said, "Well, I'm not so sure." So another week goes by. And he says, "I know my," and his mother challenged him again, and he says, "I know my grandma. She will send me that stamp album." Mother said, "Okay." Then another week goes by. So his mother says to him, what do you think we ought to do? And he says, "Here's what we'll do. I will send my grandmother a thank you note." Pretty quick, huh? And so he sends his grandmother a thank you note and says, "Dear grandmother, thank you so much for the stamp album. It hasn't arrived yet, but I know it's on the way." She gets the note and she emails him back. Let's say that, okay? And in the email she says, "Oh gosh, son, I am sorry. I did order that album for you for your birthday. It came in for me to gift wrap and it was the wrong album, so I sent it back. Then I ordered another one and they sent it to the wrong address. I'm really sorry. And then I started to order another one, but they were out. And so I looked on the internet and I found that there is a bookstore near you that carries that same stamp album. So here's a check for $15 to go get your stamp album." He looked at his mom and said, "See, I told you so." All right? So that's a story of faith. This is kind of what the widow was like. She believed that the stamp album was coming, that the solution was coming. And she believed it so much that she believed she could trust what she believed in and that she would see what she believed in. All of us have challenges in our lives, and when we go within and say, "I need help, I need direction, I need a divine idea," we open our hearts and our minds for a way to overcome an obstacle no matter how big. You and I can do that. You and I are created to do that. And so we access our Christ consciousness. We go to source. And another little story to demonstrate that. There was a guy out hunting, his daughter said. And he shared this with his daughter. And he was out hunting and he was walking along this little path. And all of a sudden, next to him, the bushes started to shake. And out jumps this bunny rabbit and goes in between his legs. That's a wild rabbit. Rabbits don't do that. But this rabbit was panting. This rabbit was worn out. This rabbit was trembling in fear. And it lodged itself right between his legs. And he thought to himself, "Wow, that's unbelievable." And then the reason for that to happen showed up. There was a weasel who came out into the road. So the hunter takes his rifle and he shoots beyond the weasel to scare the weasel away. And the weasel was so shocked that the hunter said he turned 360 in the air and went back into the woods. He gave up the idea that this was his lunch. And then after a few moments, the little rabbit stopped shaking. The little rabbit calmed down, looked up in his eyes, and he looked down at that little rabbit and said, "No problem, you're nobody's lunch today." And the rabbit walked off gently and into the woods. When we have a challenge like that rabbit, we need to go to source. We know to understand that God is always present within us, always available to us. And as we do that, we start to listen to and discern what is ours to do. Jesus said that we must be poor in spirit in order to experience the kingdom of heaven. Poor in spirit. Meaning that I have to have an empty vessel. Because what Elijah told the woman was, I want you to go back to your home. I want you to go to your neighbors and I want you to ask for empty vessels. I want you to fill up your house with empty vessels. And what he was talking about metaphysically is that we have to be empty, if you would, in order to be filled with the Spirit of God. We've got to get our stuff out of the way. We even actually have to forgive people. We actually have to say, this is just temporary. There is a solution, even if we don't feel like it. I had somebody write me this week and said, I've been in so much pain that I can't even feel God. And I wrote back and said, that's fine. We're feeling God for you. When we are in pain, sometimes we can't feel God. We can't experience what we think is God. But always remember God is there. God is present in every situation. That means God is omnipresence. And so what happens is that these vessels have to be filled. And then Elijah said, but before you fill the vessel, before you do anything, and I forgot to tell you an important part of the story, okay? And that's that Elijah asked her, what do you got in your house? And she said, well, I've got one jar of oil. That's it. Now, oil represents light, by the way, and metaphysically. And so she had this jar of light. Think of it that way for a second. And he said, now what I want you to do is collect the vessels, go to your house. I want you to shut the door behind you. And what he was saying was, I want you to go into your house with your 2 sons. And I want you to work through this process. And I want you to be in prayer and meditation. And the sons, metaphysically, mean denial and affirmation. So allow one son to support you as denying that this situation, this fear that you have, no longer has control over you. The other son, affirmation, meant that she could affirm that God is in control and all would be well. That God would supply her because God is source. And she affirmed that. And the vessels started to fill up with oil. And every vessel she had filled up. And then she said, well, are there any more vessels? And the son said, no. And so the idea is that when we have enough of what we have enough. It's okay. Because then she went back to Elijah and said, hey, these vessels filled up with oil. This is really cool. What do I do? He said, well, sell the oil to pay off the debts. And oh, by the way, there will be enough left because of your faith to take care of you and your sons for the rest of your life. What I think, as I look at this story metaphysically, is that we empty our vessel so it can be filled up. In order to be receptive, we might have to acknowledge there is a higher power working in our lives. A power that thinks divine thoughts. A power that can manifest through the power of our imagination, and a power of clarity that allows us to see and gather all the resources needed to meet our needs. Over the last couple of weeks, in 2 different classes, I've talked about the law of that law that brings things, law of attraction. Okay. I'm not supposed to talk about it 3 times, but I'm going to. Anyway, this law of attraction. And the way I tried to explain it, because some people said, I don't believe that. And I said that the universe all of a sudden starts to send things to you. I said, I don't see it quite that way. What I see is that when we let go and let God and affirm and contemplate what's going to happen, that we open up our eyes to that which is already there, that we couldn't see before. You know, somebody who doesn't feel loved, really doesn't feel loved, they don't believe anybody loves them. They can't sense it because that's what they feel. But when they change their mind and they know they're loved, everybody loves them. And so the law of attraction says that when I clean myself, I get the vessels, fear, all those things out of my head and out of my heart, then I'm able to step forward and understand that all the resources I need to solve any problem is right here, right now. Already been created. I just get the vision. I get the ability to see them. And so, as I do that, I receive clarity, and I'm able to gather all these resources together to meet my needs. Jesus said, "Blessed are the poor in spirit," I may have said that, "for theirs is the kingdom of God." To be an empty vessel means that we must pour in spirit, willing to acknowledge it is not I, but the Spirit within that does the work. In the Course in Miracles we talked about this morning, it says, you think you created yourself, but you really didn't. And because you think you created yourself, you think there are difficulties you can't overcome. But when you understand that you are created and begotten out of me, God, Spirit, Source, then you start to understand that you are not limited, but you are unlimited, that you are powerful beyond means. So what I saw this, as I envisioned this lady, I saw the vessels representing the powers that you and I have. The powers that we are given and that we have the opportunity to direct. They're already there. We just forget it sometimes. For example, there was a vessel of love. And when we step in anything with love, we have the power. There's the vessel of faith we've already talked about. Knowing there is a solution and looking for that solution and believing it can happen. There's a vessel of strength. Because you see, even in the midst of trying to demonstrate and manifest, we can sometimes get caught up in our doubts. We get confused. And it takes strength to continue the course. The power of the vessel of power itself. That through the strength of God, I have power. I am power. The vessel of divine order. That when I go into divine mind and latch hold of and believe in the divine idea that I am perfect as I am created, I then become the perfect expression of God. That's divine order. The power of understanding, that vessel of understanding, that I understand how God works and I step into universal law. The vessel of the will, that's a really simple one. We get confused by it. We can have willpower, which means that it comes from outside of myself or what I think my personality is. Or we can have the power of God, the will of God moving through us. And the only way we can do that is surrender to the will of Spirit within us. That's what will is all about, surrendering to it. And then there's the vessel of wisdom. There is the vessel of forgiveness, a big one. I'm pretty convinced that just about everything that blocks us and makes us think that we are in a state of separation is because we are not able to forgive. If you feel that way about anything, I want you today to sit alone. Go to the closet, as Elijah says. And I want you just simply to say, I forgive blank. Just say it. You may not believe it the first time. But as you do that, and you do it over and over again, the forgiveness will come. Your heart will open. love will dominate, and you will be no longer limited and in bondage to that unforgiveness that you are experiencing, but instead you will be free. And then there's the vessel of life itself. You know, when we feel free, when we are out of debt to ourselves, we then are able to experience life abundantly and joyously. In Matthew, Jesus said, a little higher consciousness, maybe what Elijah was saying, you are the salt of the earth. You are the light of the world. In the same way, let your light shine before men, that they may see your good deeds and praise your Father in heaven. Jesus also said in John, if you abide in me and my words abide in you, ask whatever you wish and it shall be done. So, what we learn is that number one, we can direct our faith. That number two, we can go within and use denials, or the power of denial, to affirm that nothing but God has anything and any power over me. And then once we've done that, we can use affirmations that affirm that God is my source. And when we do that, the challenges that lie before us, or we think lie before us, there will become opportunities for change and opportunities for growth and opportunities to really know yourself more intimately and to trust yourself 100%. Because you are the vessel that has been created through millions of years to be an expression of God, to be an expression of spirit, to be an expression of divine mind and divine idea. That's our purpose. And when we do that, coming back to that song, we then start to see, envision, and experience a world that is healed for all. A world that works for all. A world that says yes to all. A world that honors our differences and honors where we are the same. Where we are blessed and we know we are. So I suggest to you, follow the example of the widow. Use your faith. Clean your vessel if it's filled with fear. Fill it up with whatever power you might need in this moment. And as you do, know that God is your source and that all is truly well in your life. God bless you this morning, and happy Memorial Day. Thank you.